"I have nowhere to sleep tonight," said the poor girl to the Duke. No one expected this. There was a night in the autumn of 1847 when the rain fell so hard against the cobblestones of Ashworth that the sound could be mistaken for applause. But no one was clapping. No one was celebrating. The streets were empty, save for the water that poured from every gutter and every broken drain, flooding the lanes with a cold, dark river that swallowed the ankles of anyone foolish enough to be outside. The shops had closed hours ago. The taverns had bolted their doors. Even the stray dogs of Ashworth had found cover beneath the wooden carts left abandoned in the market square. And yet, standing at the iron gates of Hatherley Manor, drenched from the crown of her head to the soles of her worn-through boots, was a girl. She was 17 years old. Her name was Elara Wynne, and she had nowhere to go. Her dress, once a pale blue, was now so soaked with rain that it clung to her thin frame like a second skin, the color darkened to something closer to bruise. Her hair, a deep auburn that in daylight caught the sun like copper wire, hung in ropes around her face. Her hands gripped the iron bars of the gate, and her knuckles were white, not from effort, but from cold. She had been walking for 6 hours. She had not eaten since morning, and morning had offered only a crust of bread stolen from the kitchen of the house where she had worked until that very afternoon, when the lady of the house had discovered a silver spoon missing from the drawer and had pointed her finger at the nearest person who could not defend herself. Elara had not taken the spoon. She had never stolen anything in her life. But the accusation had been enough. In a house like that, with a mistress like that, the accusation was the conviction. There was no trial. There was no chance to speak. There was only the door, flung open into the rain, and the words that followed her out like a curse. "You are dismissed. Do not return. Do not ask for a letter of reference. You are nothing, and you will go back to nothing." And so here she was, at the gates of the largest estate in the county, staring up at the enormous stone house that rose behind the iron bars, like a fortress, built to keep out exactly the kind of person she was. She did not know why she had come here. She had no plan. She had no connection to the family that lived inside. She only knew that the road had led her here, that her legs had given out, and that the light burning in the window on the second floor was the only light she had seen in miles. She pressed her forehead against the iron gate and closed her eyes. The rain ran down her face like tears, though she refused to cry. She had promised herself that years ago, after her mother died and her father disappeared into the bottle and then into the ground after him. She had promised herself she would not cry, because crying was a luxury for people who had someone to hear them, and Elara Wynne had no one. But even promises break when the body is cold enough. She did not hear the footsteps on the gravel. She did not hear the creak of the side gate opening 30 feet to her left. She did not hear anything at all until a voice, low and sharp and utterly without warmth, said from somewhere very close behind her, "You are trespassing." She spun around so fast she nearly fell. And there, standing in the rain without an umbrella, without a coat, wearing only a white shirt soaked transparent against his chest, and dark trousers tucked into riding boots, was a man. He was tall. That was the first thing she noticed. Tall in the way that made the space around him feel smaller, as though the world had to rearrange itself to make room. His hair was black and plastered to his skull by the rain, and his face was the kind of face that looked like it had been carved from the same stone as the house behind him. High cheekbones, a jaw that could have been drawn with a ruler, eyes so pale they were almost silver, catching the faint light from the distant window like the surface of a frozen lake. He was perhaps 28. He looked older, not in his skin, which was smooth and unmarked, but in his eyes, which carried the weight of a man who had seen something he could not unsee. This was Lord Adrian Hatherley, the 5th Duke of Ashworth, and he had not spoken to a woman who was not a servant or a relative in over 2 years. "I said," he repeated, and his voice was quieter now, but no less dangerous. "You are trespassing." Ilara stared at him. The rain pounded against both of them equally, as though the sky did not care about the difference in their stations. She opened her mouth, and what came out was not an apology. It was not an excuse. It was the truth, stripped bare of every decoration, every pretense, every polite fiction that a girl in her position was supposed to wrap around her words like a bandage. "I have nowhere to sleep tonight," she said. 5 words. They fell between them like stones dropped into still water, and the silence that followed was louder than the storm. The Duke did not move. His expression did not change. He stood there, rain streaming down his face, his pale eyes fixed on this girl who had appeared at his gate like something the storm had dragged in, and he said nothing. For a long time, he said nothing at all. And this is where the story begins. Not with the rain, not with the gate, not with the girl or the Duke or the silver spoon that was never stolen. It begins in the silence between 2 people who had absolutely no reason to matter to each other, and every reason to walk away. If you have ever believed that a single moment can change the entire direction of a life, then you already understand what happened next. And if you have not believed that, this story will change your mind. Stay until the end. You will not regret it. Now, let us go back to the silence. The Duke stared at the girl. The girl stared at the Duke. The rain continued to fall, indifferent to both of them, and somewhere in the dark behind the manor house, a horse stamped its hoof in a stable and let out a low, restless sound that carried across the grounds like a question no one had asked. Lord Adrian Hatherley had not expected to find anyone at his gate. He had not expected to be outside at all. He had been in his study, the room on the 2nd floor whose window burned with the light Ilara had seen from the road, sitting behind a mahogany desk covered in letters he had not opened and documents he had not signed, staring at the wall and thinking about nothing and everything at the same time, which was what he did most evenings now. Then the restlessness had taken him, the way it always did, like a hand closing around his chest from the inside, and he had stood, walked down the stairs, through the great hall with its portraits of dead Hatherleys staring down at him with expressions that ranged from smug to disappointed, past the kitchens where Mrs. Aldridge, the cook, had left a plate of cold supper he would not eat, and out into the rain. He walked the grounds at night. It was the only time he felt something close to peace, when the house was behind him and the sky was above him, and there was no one to ask him questions he did not want to answer. "Are you well, Your Grace? Shall I send for the doctor, Your Grace? Will you be attending the harvest ball, Your Grace?" The answer to all of them was the same. No. Leave me alone. But tonight, the grounds had offered him something other than silence. They had offered him a girl at his gate, soaked to the bone, with eyes the color of dark honey, and a voice that cut through the rain like a knife through silk. "I have nowhere to sleep tonight." He should have sent her away. That was the correct thing to do. That was what any duke, any lord, any man of his standing would have done. You called for a footman. You instructed them to escort the trespasser to the village. You returned to your study, your letters, your war. You did not stand in the rain staring at a stranger as though she had said something that mattered. But Adrian Hatherley did not move, because the truth he would not have admitted to anyone, not to his valet, not to his sister, not to the portrait of his dead father hanging above the fireplace in the great hall, was that he recognized something in those 5 words. Not the girl, not her face or her voice or her bedraggled condition. He recognized the feeling beneath the words, the feeling of having nowhere to go, of standing at the edge of the world and realizing that no door would open for you, and that the rain would not stop, and that the cold would only get worse. He had felt that feeling 2 years ago, on the night his wife died. Lady Catherine Hatherley, born Lady Catherine Ashmore, dead at 24 of a fever that had taken her in 3 days. 3 days. That was all it had taken to dismantle his entire understanding of the world. She had been laughing on a Tuesday, coughing on a Wednesday, burning on a Thursday, and gone by Friday morning. He had held her hand as she left, and the last thing she had said to him was not, "I love you," or "I will miss you," or even "goodbye." The last thing she had said was, "Adrian, the window. I am so cold. Close the window." And he had closed it, and she had closed her eyes, and that was the end. After that, the Duke had become a locked door. He had sealed himself inside his grief the way a man seals himself inside a tomb, and he had not come out. The servants whispered about it. The county whispered about it. His sister, Lady Rosalind, who lived in London and wrote him letters every week that he never answered, whispered about it in her own way, which was to say she did not whisper at all, but wrote in large, underlined words, "Adrian, you cannot live like this. You are 28 years old. You are not dead. Stop behaving as though you are." But he was dead, or at least the part of him that had known how to feel anything other than guilt and grief was dead, and the rest of him was simply going through the motions of living because he did not know how to stop. Until tonight. Until the girl at the gate. "How old are you?" he asked. His voice came out rougher than he intended, as though the words had to climb over something stuck in his throat. 17, Elara said. "And you are alone?" "Yes. In this weather. I did not choose the weather." There it was. The spark. The tiny, defiant flame that refused to be extinguished, even in the middle of a storm that should have drowned it. He saw it in her eyes, in the way her chin lifted half an inch, in the way her fingers, which had been trembling at her sides, suddenly went still, as though she had made a decision about who she was going to be in this moment, and had chosen someone who did not tremble. The Duke looked at her for 3 more seconds. Then he turned on his heel and walked toward the side gate. "Follow me," he said, without looking back. Elara did not move. "Why?" He stopped. No one had asked him why in a very long time. His servants did what he said because he was the Duke. His tenants did what he said because he owned their land. His sister did what he said because, well, actually his sister never did what he said, but that was beside the point. The point was that this girl, this soaking, shivering, trespassing girl, had looked at an open door and asked why instead of walking through it. "Because," he said, and his voice was flat and cold and gave away nothing. "The groundskeeper sets traps for foxes along the east wall, and if you sleep out here, you will lose a foot by morning. I am not interested in explaining that to the magistrate." It was not kindness. He wanted to be very clear about that, both to her and to himself. It was practicality. It was the avoidance of inconvenience. It was absolutely, categorically, without question, not kindness. Elara studied him through the rain. Then she walked through the gate. They crossed the grounds in silence, the gravel crunching under their feet, the rain still falling in sheets around them. The manor house grew larger with every step, its stone walls rising up like cliffs, its windows dark, except for the one on the second floor that still burned with the light from the Duke's study. Elara had never been inside a house like this. The largest building she had ever entered was the church in the village where she had grown up, and that had seemed enormous to her when she was small, with its vaulted ceiling and its stained glass windows that turned the sunlight into colors she had no names for. But this house made the church look like a cupboard. This house had wings. It had towers. It had a front entrance with columns so tall that the rain falling from their tops took a full second to reach the ground. The Duke did not take her to the front entrance. He led her around the side of the house, past a walled garden she could barely see in the dark, through a narrow wooden door that opened into a corridor lit by a single oil lamp mounted on the wall. The corridor was warm. That was the first thing Ilara felt, and it nearly broke her. The warmth. After 6 hours of rain and cold and walking, the simple, unremarkable warmth of an enclosed space hit her like a wave, and she had to stop and press her hand against the wall to keep from falling. The Duke did not notice, or if he noticed, he did not show it. He walked ahead of her down the corridor, his boots leaving wet prints on the stone floor, and stopped at a door at the far end. "Mrs. Aldridge," he said, knocking twice. There was a shuffling sound, then the door opened, and a woman appeared. She was perhaps 50, with grey hair pulled back in a bun, a round face that looked like it had been designed specifically for the purpose of worrying about other people, and a white apron, dusted with flour even though it was nearly midnight. "Your Grace," she said, and then she saw Ilara, and her eyes went wide. "Oh, my lord, the child is half drowned." "She needs a room," the Duke said. "Something in the servants' quarters, clean sheets, warm food, dry clothing if you have it." He paused. "She is not a guest. She is a temporary inconvenience. She will be gone by morning." And with that, he turned and walked away. No good night, no further explanation, no second glance at the girl he had just pulled from the rain like a half-drowned cat from a river. He simply left, his wet boots echoing down the corridor, and disappeared around the corner. Mrs. Aldridge looked at Ilara. Ilara looked at Mrs. Aldridge. "Well," the cook said softly, and there was something in her voice that sounded like the beginning of a story she had been waiting to tell for a very long time. "Come in then, love. Let us get you warm." She led Ilara through the kitchen, which was the largest room Ilara had ever seen that was not a church. Copper pots hung from iron hooks along the ceiling. A fireplace large enough to stand in occupied the far wall, and though the fire had burned low, the embers still glowed orange and threw a weak, flickering light across the stone floor. Mrs. Aldridge sat Ilara down on a wooden stool beside the fire, wrapped a wool blanket around her shoulders, and placed a bowl of soup in her hands so quickly that Ilara suspected she had been cooking for ghosts, and was relieved to finally have a real person to feed. "Eat," Mrs. Aldridge said. "Do not speak, do not explain. Eat first. Everything else can wait." Ilara ate. The soup was thick and hot, and tasted like onions and potatoes, and something she could not identify, but which turned out to be kindness, which is an ingredient that does not appear in any recipe, but is present in every meal made by someone who cares whether you live or die. As she ate, Mrs. Aldridge bustled around the kitchen, pulling a nightgown from a cupboard, filling a basin with warm water, laying out a towel. She did all of this without asking a single question, which was, Ilara thought, either the most polite or the most strategic thing anyone had ever done for her. It was Mrs. Aldridge who finally broke the silence, not with a question, but with a statement that landed in the warm kitchen like a pebble dropped into a pond. "He has not brought anyone through that door in 2 years, she said. Ilara looked up from her soup. "What?" "His Grace, the Duke." Mrs. Aldridge folded the towel with the precise, deliberate movements of a woman who had been folding things in this kitchen for 30 years. "Since Lady Catherine passed, God rest her, he has not spoken to anyone outside this house except the vicar and the solicitor, and he spoke to the solicitor only to tell him to stop writing letters. He does not attend dinners. He does not receive visitors. He does not go to London. He does not go anywhere. He walks the grounds at night like a haunt and sits in that study all day reading the same books over and over, as though they might say something different the 100th time." She paused. "And tonight, in the worst storm we have had since March, he found you at the gate and brought you inside." "He said I was a temporary inconvenience," Ilara said. Mrs. Aldridge smiled. and it was the kind of smile that contained an entire library of things she knew and was not yet ready to share. "Yes," she said. "He would say that." She showed Ilara to a small room on the 3rd floor, in the servants' corridor, a room with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the grounds. The rain was still falling, but from inside, with dry clothes and warm soup in her stomach and a wool blanket around her shoulders, the rain sounded different. It sounded almost beautiful. Ilara lay in the bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about the Duke. She thought about his pale eyes and his sharp voice, and the way he had stood in the rain without a coat, as though he did not believe he deserved protection from the cold. She thought about the way he had said, "Follow me," not as an invitation, but as an order, and the way he had walked away without looking back, as though the act of helping her was something he needed to complete quickly before he changed his mind. She thought about Mrs. Aldridge's words. "He has not brought anyone through that door in 2 years." Then she closed her eyes, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she slept without dreaming of the things she had lost. Morning came, and the rain had stopped. Ilara woke to the sound of birdsong and the pale grey light of an autumn dawn pressing through the small window above her bed. For a moment, she did not know where she was. The ceiling was too high. The sheets were too clean. The air smelled like beeswax and lavender, instead of the damp, sour smell of the servants' quarters at her last place of employment. Then she remembered. The gate, the rain, the Duke. She sat up and looked around the room. Someone had come in while she slept and left a bundle of clothing on the chair beside the washstand. A plain grey dress, darned at the elbows but clean, a pair of stockings, and a white apron. Servants' clothing. Beside the clothing was a note, written in a hand that was round and practical, and entirely without flourish. "Come to the kitchen when you are dressed. Do not go anywhere else. Mrs. A." Ilara dressed. The grey dress was slightly too large for her, hanging loose at the shoulders and long at the wrists. But it was dry, and it was warm, and it did not belong to anyone who had accused her of theft, and for these 3 reasons, she loved it more than any garment she had ever worn. She found her way down to the kitchen by following the smell of bread. Mrs. Aldridge was already at the stove, moving between pots and pans with the efficiency of a general commanding an army that happened to be made of breakfast. "Sit," Mrs. Aldridge said, pointing to the same stool by the fire. "Tea? Toast? Then we talk." Ilara sat. She drank the tea. She ate the toast. She waited. "His Grace has informed me," Mrs. Aldridge began, pouring herself a cup of tea and sitting down opposite Ilara with the air of a woman who is about to negotiate a treaty, "that you are to leave this morning. He has instructed Mr. Farrow, the coachman, to take you to the village in the cart, where you may inquire at the inn about work." Ilara nodded. She had expected this. She had expected less than this, honestly. She had expected to wake up and find the door locked and a footman waiting to escort her off the property. "However," Mrs. Aldridge continued, and she held the word "however" the way a card player holds the winning hand, laying it down slowly, savoring it. "I have informed His Grace that we are short a maid. Mary left last month to marry the blacksmith's son. Agnes is down with a bad knee and cannot manage the stairs. The east wing has not been properly cleaned since August, and I cannot do everything myself, as I have told him repeatedly, and as he has repeatedly ignored." She took a sip of tea. "I have suggested that you might stay, temporarily, on a trial basis, until we find a proper replacement." Ilara's hands tightened around her cup. "And what did the Duke say?" Mrs. Aldridge smiled again, that same smile from the night before, the one that contained a library. "He said, and I quote, 'Do what you like, Mrs. Aldridge. I do not care.'" That sounds like a no. That, my dear girl, is the closest thing to a yes that man has given anyone in 2 years. And so, Ilara stayed. The first week was a kind of careful, quiet warfare. Not between Ilara and the Duke, because the Duke did not acknowledge her existence. Not between Ilara and the other servants, because the other servants were few and tired and grateful for an extra pair of hands. The warfare was between Ilara and the house itself. Hatherley Manor was enormous. It had 47 rooms, not counting the kitchens, the cellars, the attics, and the stable block. It had corridors that seemed to lead nowhere, and staircases that appeared without warning, rising into parts of the house that Ilara was told, in firm tones by Mrs. Aldridge, she was not to enter. The West Wing is His Grace's private quarters. The library is His Grace's private domain. The study on the second floor is His Grace's sanctuary, and you are never, under any circumstances, to knock on that door unless the house is on fire, and even then, consider whether the fire might resolve itself before disturbing him. Ilara cleaned. She swept and mopped and polished and scrubbed. She carried buckets of water up 3 flights of stairs because the pump on the 3rd floor had been broken since June, and no one had fixed it because the Duke had not noticed, because the Duke did not go to the 3rd floor, because the Duke did not go anywhere except his study, the grounds at night, and occasionally the dining room, where he ate alone at a table that could seat 24. She learned the house the way a person learns a language, 1 room at a time, 1 word at a time. She learned that the floorboards in the east corridor creaked in a pattern that sounded almost like a melody if you stepped on them in the right order. She learned that the windows in the morning room faced east and caught the sunrise in a way that set the whole room on fire with gold and pink, and that no one ever saw it because no one used the morning room anymore. She learned that there was a portrait of Lady Catherine in the upstairs hall, hung between a landscape of the moors and a still knife of fruit that looked as though it had been painted by someone who had never seen fruit but had heard a very detailed description of it. She stopped in front of the portrait on her 3rd day. Lady Catherine Hatherley looked out from the canvas with calm, intelligent eyes and a mouth that seemed to be holding back a smile, as though the painter had caught her in the middle of a thought she found privately amusing. She had dark hair, darker than the Duke's, and her skin was pale, and she wore a green dress with a high collar and a cameo brooch at her throat. She was beautiful, but not in the way Ilara had expected. Not in the cold, porcelain way of the ladies she had seen in shop windows and fashion plates. Beautiful in a warm way, a real way. The kind of beauty that came from being alive and interested in the world, and slightly amused by it. "She was kind," said a voice behind her, and Ilara jumped so hard she nearly dropped the broom she was carrying. It was Mr. Pemberton, the butler. He was a thin, precise man of 60, with silver hair combed flat against his skull, and a waistcoat so perfectly pressed that it seemed to have been ironed by God. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, looking at the portrait with an expression that Ilara could not quite read. It was not sadness, exactly. It was something older than sadness, something that had once been sadness and had hardened into something quieter, like a riverbed after the water dries up. "She used to come into the kitchen at midnight," he said, still looking at the portrait, "and make Mrs. Aldridge teach her how to bake bread. She was terrible at it. She burned everything. His Grace would find flour on the banister in the morning and pretend not to notice." A pause. He noticed everything about her. He simply chose to let her believe she was getting away with things. Ilara looked back at the portrait. He loved her. "That," said Mr. Pemberton, with the gravity of a man delivering a verdict, "is an understatement of such magnitude that it borders on insult." He walked away, his footsteps silent on the carpet, and Ilara was left alone with the portrait of a dead woman and the slow, dawning understanding that the house she had stumbled into was not merely large and cold and full of rooms that no one used. It was a monument. It was a tomb. It was a man's grief made into stone and glass and silence. And she was walking through it with a broom, sweeping floors that had not been dirty since the last person who had made them feel like home had stopped breathing. She did not see the Duke for the first 3 days. She heard him, sometimes, at night, his boots on the gravel outside as he walked the grounds. She saw the evidence of him, the cold supper left uneaten on the dining room table, the books rearranged in the library, the lamp burning in the study window long after midnight. But the man himself was a ghost in his own house, present only in the signs of his absence, and Elara began to wonder if Mrs. Aldridge had invented the rule about not disturbing him, not to protect his privacy, but to protect the illusion that he existed at all. On the 4th day, she saw him. It was early morning, earlier than she usually rose, but she had been unable to sleep. She had come downstairs to start the fires in the morning room and the drawing room, carrying a bucket of kindling and a box of matches, and she had turned the corner into the main hall and stopped dead. He was standing at the foot of the grand staircase, fully dressed in riding clothes, his back to her, staring up at the portrait of his wife. He did not move. He did not appear to be breathing. He simply stood there, a tall, dark figure against the pale stone of the hall, looking up at the painted face of the woman he had lost, and the stillness of him was so complete and so absolute that Elara felt as though she had walked into a church during a prayer and did not know whether to kneel or run. She tried to back away. She tried to retreat the way she had come, to slip around the corner and pretend she had never been there at all. But the kindling shifted in the bucket, and a piece of wood knocked against the metal side with a sound that, in the silence of the hall, was as loud as a gunshot. The Duke turned. His eyes found her immediately. In the grey light of early morning, they were not silver, but something colder, something closer to ice, and they fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel as though she had been pinned to the wall. He did not speak. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the space between them, perhaps 30 feet of cold stone floor, felt like an ocean. "I am sorry," Elara said. "I did not mean to disturb you." He said nothing for a long moment. Then, in a voice as flat and empty as the hall itself, he said, "You did not disturb me. I was already disturbed." And he walked past her, through the front door, and out into the morning, where the sky was the color of ash, and the first frost of the season had turned the grass to silver. Elara stood in the hall and breathed. Her heart was beating very fast, though she could not have said exactly why. He had barely spoken. He had not been cruel. He had not even been cold, not truly. He had been something else, something she did not have a word for yet, something that lived in the space between cold and broken, between anger and exhaustion, between a man who wanted to feel nothing and a man who felt everything and wished he did not. She set down the kindling. She looked up at the portrait of Lady Catherine. "I am sorry about your husband," she said quietly, to the painted woman with the almost smile. "He seems very lost." The painting did not answer. Paintings never do. But Elara could have sworn, in the grey light, that the almost smile deepened by a fraction, as though Lady Catherine, wherever she was, agreed. The days passed. Elara cleaned. The Duke avoided her. The house stood between them like a country neither had agreed to share, and they moved through it on separate paths, orbiting each other without collision, without conversation, without anything that could be called a connection. But Elara noticed things. She could not help it. Noticing things was what she did. It was the skill she had developed in every household where she had worked, the skill that had kept her alive and employed, and one step ahead of the casual cruelties that were the daily currency of life in service. She noticed which floorboards creaked. She noticed which doors were left ajar and which were locked. She noticed the moods of her employers, the way a sailor notices the wind, by the smallest signs, the angle of a frown, the speed of a footstep, the particular quantity of a silence. And so she noticed the Duke. She noticed that he ate almost nothing. The plates that came back to the kitchen were nearly full, the food rearranged rather than consumed, as though he had pushed it around with his fork to create the appearance of having eaten, without actually doing so. She noticed that the circles under his eyes were growing darker, week by week, as though sleep was a country he had been exiled from, and could not find his way back to. She noticed that the books in the library were always the same books, pulled from the shelf and returned to a different position, a cycle of reading and rereading that suggested not enjoyment, but compulsion, the way a man trapped in a maze walks the same corridors over and over, hoping the walls might rearrange themselves. She noticed that he stood in front of his wife's portrait every morning. She noticed that he stayed longer each time. And she noticed, on the morning of her 11th day at Hatherley Manor, that the window in the study on the second floor, the window whose light had led her to the gate on the night of the storm, was open. In October. In the cold. Wide open, as though whoever sat behind it had decided they no longer cared about the difference between inside and outside, between warmth and cold, between alive and not. She carried this observation to Mrs. Aldridge, who received it with a tightening of her mouth that said more than words could have. "He has always been careless with himself," Mrs. Aldridge said, rolling pastry with a force that suggested the pastry had personally offended her. "Even before, Lady Catherine used to worry. She used to say he took no more care of himself than a man who did not believe he was worth the trouble. And now that she is gone, there is no one to worry, and so he is worse." "Someone should close the window," Ilara said. "Someone should do a great many things," Mrs. Aldridge replied. "But His Grace does not welcome intervention. His Grace does not welcome anything at all, except possibly the end of days, and even that I suspect he would find disappointing." Ilara said nothing more. She went about her work. She swept the floors and polished the silver, and carried the hot water upstairs, and did everything she was supposed to do, exactly as she was supposed to do it. And then, at the end of her shift, when the house was quiet and the other servants had gone to their rooms, she climbed the stairs to the second floor. She walked down the corridor, past the portraits and the landscapes and the still life of suspicious fruit. She stopped at the door of the study. She knocked. There was a silence so complete that she could hear the ticking of the clock in the hallway behind her, and the beating of her own heart, and, from somewhere very far away, the sound of wind moving through the open window. "Who is it?" The voice came from inside, flat and uninterested, as though whoever was asking already knew the answer would not matter. "It is Ilara," she said, "the new maid." Another silence, longer this time. Then, "I did not send for a maid." "No, you did not. But your window is open and the room must be freezing, and Mrs. Aldridge will blame me if you catch pneumonia, because she blames me for everything, and I have only been here 11 days, and I would like to keep my position for at least 12. She heard a sound from inside the study. It was so brief and so quiet that she almost missed it, and it took her a full second to identify it, because it was a sound she had not associated with this house, or this man, or anything within these walls. It was a laugh. A single, short, involuntary laugh, as though something had escaped from behind a locked door before the occupant could slam it shut. The study door opened. The Duke stood there, looking down at her with those ice-colored eyes, and his expression was the same as always, closed and guarded and giving nothing away. But there was something at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile, not even close to a smile, just the faintest disruption in the line of his lips, as though a smile had thought about appearing and then decided to wait. "Close the window then," he said, "and leave." Ilara walked into the study. It was exactly as she had imagined it, and nothing like she had imagined it. It was large, lined with bookshelves from floor to ceiling, with a mahogany desk positioned in front of the window, and 2 leather chairs beside a fireplace that had burned down to ash. The desk was covered in papers, letters, documents, all in varying states of neglect. Some were still sealed, some had been opened and then folded back into their envelopes, as though the act of reading them had been too exhausting to complete. The window was indeed open, and the October air was pouring through it, like water through a breach in a dam, cold and merciless. Ilara crossed the room, reached for the window latch, and pulled it shut. The silence that followed the removal of the wind was immediate and total, and the room seemed to exhale, as though it had been holding its breath. She turned to leave. She had every intention of leaving. She had been told to close the window and leave, and she was going to do exactly that, because she needed this job, and she was not a fool, and the Duke was her employer, and his grief was not her business. But then she saw the desk, and what was on it, and she stopped. Between the letters and documents, half hidden beneath a leather-bound book, was a piece of paper. And on the paper, drawn in charcoal with a hand that was clearly skilled, but equally clearly out of practice, was a face. A woman's face. Dark hair, pale skin, a mouth that was almost smiling. Lady Catherine. It was not a finished drawing. It was a study, the kind of thing an artist does when they are trying to capture something from memory, when the image is beginning to blur and they are fighting to hold on to it. The lines were uncertain in places, retraced, corrected, retraced again. The eyes were wrong. Even Ilara could see that. They were close, but they were wrong, as though the artist could remember the shape but not the light that had lived inside them. She looked at the drawing. She looked at the Duke. He was watching her with an expression that had changed from indifference to something sharper, something that looked very much like fear. The fear of being seen, the fear of having a private wound exposed to a stranger's gaze. "You draw," she said. "I used to." "This is her." "It is supposed to be." His voice was tight, controlled, each word measured and released like a breath held too long. "I cannot get the eyes right. I have been trying for months. I have a portrait on the wall, and I have my memory, and I cannot get the eyes right. And I do not know if it is because my skill has deteriorated, or because I am forgetting what she looked like." The words came out in a rush, fast and raw and entirely unplanned. And the moment they were in the air, the Duke's face closed like a door slamming shut. He turned away from her, toward the fireplace, and his jaw clenched and released, and his hands, which had been at his sides, curled into fists. "Leave," he said. "Now." Ilara left, but she carried those words with her down the stairs, and through the corridor, and into the small room on the 3rd floor where she slept. And she lay in her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, and thought about a man who sat alone in a cold room, night after night, trying to draw a face he was terrified of forgetting. And something shifted inside her, something small and quiet, and entirely uninvited. Not pity. Pity was for people who could afford to look down, and Ilara was in no position to look down on anyone. It was something else. Recognition. The same recognition the Duke had felt at the gate. The understanding that grief and loneliness are not the exclusive property of any class or station. That a duke in a manor house can be just as lost as a girl in the rain. And that the walls people build to protect themselves are the same walls that keep them trapped. She did not sleep for a long time that night. And when she finally did, she dreamed of charcoal lines on paper, and eyes that could not be gotten right, and a window thrown open to the cold, as though the person behind it was trying to feel something, anything, even if the only thing available was pain. The next morning, Ilara found a book on the kitchen table. It was small, leather-bound, and old, and it had been placed beside her cup of tea with the kind of deliberate casualness that suggested someone had gone to considerable effort to make it look accidental. She opened it. It was a collection of poems. Inside the front cover, in a handwriting she did not recognize, someone had written, "For the maid who closes windows, the fire could use attention as well." She looked at Mrs. Aldridge, who was frying eggs with her back turned, and an expression of aggressive innocence. "Mrs. Aldridge," Ilara said slowly, "did the Duke leave this for me?" "I am sure I would not know, dear. I am a cook. I cook. I do not monitor the reading habits of the household." "It has a message in it." "How fascinating. Eat your eggs." Ilara ate her eggs. She put the book in the pocket of her apron, and she carried it with her all day as she worked, feeling its weight against her hip like a secret. She did not open it again until that evening, when she was alone in her room, and she read the first poem by candlelight. It was about loss. Of course it was. It was about the particular kind of loss that comes not from a single catastrophe, but from the slow erosion of hope, the way a river erodes a bank, grain by grain, until one day you look up and the ground you were standing on is gone. But the last stanza was different. The last stanza turned. It said that loss, real loss, the kind that strips you down to nothing, is also the only door to a new beginning, because you cannot build something new on ground that is still occupied. You have to lose the ground first. Ilara read it 3 times. Then she closed the book and held it against her chest, and understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that the Duke was trying to tell her something, not about himself, about her, about the silver spoon and the dismissal and the rain and the gate, and the question she had not yet asked herself, which was, what now? The next morning, she went to the study. She knocked. The door opened. The Duke stood there, and this time his expression was not flat or cold or guarded. It was wary. It was the expression of a man who had done something impulsive, a man who had left a book on a kitchen table for a girl he barely knew and was now confronting the consequences of that impulse, and was not sure whether to retreat or hold his ground. "Thank you for the book," Ilara said. "I do not know what you are referring to." "The book of poems, with the message inside." "I left no message." "It says, for the maid who closes windows, the fire could use attention as well." The Duke looked at her. His pale eyes moved across her face, as though he was searching for something, some sign of mockery or judgment, or the kind of pitying softness that would have made him slam the door and never open it again. He did not find it. What he found instead was a girl in a grey dress that was too large for her, with dark, honey eyes that met his without flinching, without bowing, without any of the careful, submissive, downward glances that he had come to expect from every person in this house, and in this county, and in this entire, suffocating world. "The fire," he said finally, stepping back from the doorway, "has been out for 3 days." Ilara walked past him into the study. She knelt by the fireplace, cleared the old ash, laid fresh kindling, and struck a match. The flame caught. It grew. It spread across the kindling with a soft, crackling sound that filled the silence of the room like a conversation, and the warmth began to reach outward, tentatively, as though it was not sure it was welcome. She stood. She turned. The Duke was still standing by the door, watching her, and the firelight was doing something to his face that the grey light of morning had never done. It was softening it, warming it, revealing the architecture beneath the stone, the faint lines around his eyes that might have been from laughter once, a long time ago, the fullness of his mouth, that was so often pressed into a hard, flat line that she had forgotten it had another shape. "You should eat more," she said. His eyebrows rose. It was the most expression she had seen from him, and it looked almost comical on his severe face, like a statue attempting to look surprised. "Excuse me?" The plates come back to the kitchen full. Mrs. Aldridge pretends not to notice, but she cooks more every day hoping you will eat something, and you never do. And she is running out of recipes, and I think she is considering goose. And the last time she made goose, Mr. Pemberton said it tasted like a leather shoe soaked in regret, and I do not think that will help anyone. The Duke stared at her. The silence stretched. Elara's heart was hammering, because she had just told a duke, her employer, the most powerful man in the county, that he was not eating enough. And she had done it while insulting the cook's goose, and she was almost certainly about to be dismissed for the second time in a month. And then it happened again. The sound. The laugh. Not the short, involuntary bark from the night before, but something longer, something warmer, something that came from a place deeper than habit or reflex. It was a real laugh, and it transformed his face so completely that Elara felt as though she was seeing an entirely different person. A person who had existed before the grief, before the locked doors and the cold rooms and the portraits of a woman whose eyes he could not get right. The laugh lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then it stopped, as suddenly as it had started, and the Duke's face closed again, and the shadow returned. And he looked away from her, as though she had caught him doing something he was ashamed of. "You may go," he said, and his voice was rougher than before. Elara went, but she left the fire burning. After that, things changed. The changes were small, so small that only someone who was paying very close attention would have noticed them. And, as it happened, the only people in Hatherley Manor who paid very close attention to anything were Elara, Mrs. Aldridge, and Mr. Pemberton, and all 3 of them noticed. The Duke began to eat. Not much, not enough, but the plates that came back to the kitchen were slightly less full than before, and Mrs. Aldridge received this information with the restrained triumph of a general who has won a minor battle in a very long war. The study window stayed closed. The fire in the study stayed lit. And, most remarkably, the Duke began to leave his study during daylight hours. Not often, not for long, but Elara would be polishing the banister in the main hall and hear footsteps on the stairs, and she would look up, and there he would be, descending with a book under his arm or a cup of tea in his hand, and he would pass her without speaking, but he would not look away. He would not pretend she did not exist. He would meet her eyes for a single, brief moment, and then he would continue walking, and the moment would be over. But it would leave something behind, a warmth, a residue, like the heat from a candle that has been blown out. On the 14th day of her employment, Elara found a second book on the kitchen table. This one was about botany. Inside the front cover, "For the maid who tends fires, the garden is in a terrible state." She smiled. She could not help it. On the 15th day, she went to the garden. It was, as the Duke had written, in a terrible state. The walled garden behind the house had clearly once been beautiful. There were the bones of it still visible beneath the neglect. Stone paths arranged in geometric patterns. Beds divided by low box hedges that had grown wild and shapeless. A sundial in the center, covered in moss so thick it could no longer tell the time. Rose bushes, unpruned for 2 years, had grown into tangles of thorn and dead wood, and the autumn leaves had fallen and rotted and formed a thick, wet carpet over everything, as though the garden was trying to bury itself. But there were things still growing. There were late chrysanthemums in copper and gold, fighting through the weeds. There was a climbing rose on the south wall that had refused to die, its last blooms still open, pale pink and defiant against the grey stone. And there was a patch of lavender beside the sundial that, even in October, still carried its scent, faint but present, like a memory that has not quite faded. Ilara knelt beside the lavender and began to pull weeds. She did not know much about gardening. Her mother had kept a window box with herbs in it, in the tiny cottage where Ilara had been born, and Ilara remembered the smell of basil and rosemary, and the way her mother's hands had been always slightly green at the fingertips. But she did not know the proper way to tend a garden. She only knew how to clear away the things that did not belong and make room for the things that did. She worked for 2 hours. She cleared the weeds from around the sundial and scraped the moss from its face, and the shadow fell across the carved hours and told her it was 3:30, which was a piece of information the sundial had been waiting 2 years to share and seemed pleased to finally deliver. She pruned the rose bushes as best she could, cutting away the dead wood with a pair of shears she found rusting in a shed at the back of the garden. And beneath the dead wood, she found new growth, green shoots that had been waiting, patient and stubborn, for someone to give them room to reach the light. She did not know that the Duke was watching her from the study window. She did not know that he had been standing there for over an hour, his hand resting on the glass, looking down at the girl in the grey dress who was kneeling in his dead wife's garden and bringing it back to life, and that something inside him, something that had been frozen and silent for 2 years, had cracked. Not broken, not thawed, just cracked. The way ice cracks before the spring, a single fracture line running through the surface, too thin to see, but deep enough to change everything. He did not go down to the garden. He was not ready for that. But he stayed at the window, and he watched, and when she stood up and brushed the dirt from her knees and looked up at the house, he did not step back into the shadow. He let her see him. Their eyes met across the distance, across the garden and the window, and the difference between them. And Ilara raised her hand. Not a wave, just a gesture, an acknowledgement. And the Duke raised his in return. And the gesture was so small and so new that it seemed to tremble in the air between them, like the first note of a song that neither of them knew the words to yet. 3 weeks passed. The garden came back to life, slowly, under Ilara's hands. The study fire stayed lit. The Duke ate more. The books kept appearing on the kitchen table, one every few days, each with a message inside, each message slightly longer than the last. For the maid who gardens. You pruned the wrong rosebush. The damask, not the bourbon, though the bourbon probably deserved it. For the maid who reads. Your opinion of the 3rd poem in the collection was incorrect. It is about grief, not regret, though I concede the two are cousins. For the maid who argues about poetry in the margins of books that do not belong to her. You have handwriting like a deranged sparrow. It is oddly legible. Because Ilara had started writing back. She had taken the first book of poems and, in the margins, in her small, cramped hand, she had written her thoughts. Not analyses, not scholarly observations, just honest reactions. This one made me cry. This one made me angry. This one I did not understand at all, but I read it 4 times, and it made me feel like standing on a cliff in the wind, so perhaps understanding is not the point. She had left the book on the kitchen table, where the Duke would find it, and the next morning it was gone, and the morning after that, a new book appeared with a new message, and so began the strangest conversation Ilara had ever been part of, a conversation conducted entirely in the margins of borrowed books, across the distance of a house that was slowly, imperceptibly, becoming smaller. Mrs. Aldridge said nothing about the books. Mr. Pemberton said nothing about the books. Agnes, the maid with the bad knee, said nothing about anything, because Agnes was 47 years old and had learned that saying nothing was the single most effective strategy for surviving life in a great house. But there was a quality to the silence of the servants that week, a kind of watchful, breath-held quality, as though the entire household was standing very still and listening for a sound they had not heard in a very long time. It was on the 23rd day that the conversation moved from the margins of books to the air between two people. Elara was in the library. She was supposed to be dusting. She was actually reading, which was the same thing as dusting, except that it involved significantly less dust and significantly more imagination. She had pulled a book from the shelf, a thick, illustrated volume about Italian architecture, and had become so absorbed in a chapter about the design of the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence that she did not hear the door open behind her. "That book," said the Duke, "is shelved incorrectly. It belongs in the east case, between the Palladio and the Brunelleschi." Elara did not drop the book, which she considered a significant victory. She turned, slowly, and found the Duke standing in the doorway, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed, looking at her with an expression that was as close to relaxed as she had ever seen him. His hair was slightly disheveled, as though he had been running his hand through it, and the top button of his shirt was undone. And these two small details, the hair and the button, made him look younger and more human and more dangerous. Though the danger was not the kind that comes from anger, but the kind that comes from someone who is beginning to let their guard down and does not yet know what to do with the space that creates. "I was dusting," Elara said. "You were reading." "I was dusting with my eyes." The corner of his mouth twitched. Not a smile, not yet, but the ghost of one, the outline, the possibility. "You write interesting things in the margins of my books," he said. "They are interesting books." "You disagreed with Tennyson." "Tennyson disagreed with himself. I merely pointed it out." "You called Keats overwrought." "Keats is overwrought. He uses 14 words where 3 would do. He is the literary equivalent of someone who brings an orchestra to a conversation that requires a single violin." The Duke stared at her, and then, slowly, like the sun rising over a landscape that has been in shadow for a very long time, he smiled. It was a full smile, a real smile. It changed his face so completely that Elara felt the ground shift beneath her feet, because the man who was smiling at her was not the Duke of Ashworth, not the cold, grieving, untouchable figure that the county whispered about and the servants tiptoed around. He was someone else entirely. Someone who had been hiding behind the Duke's face for 2 years, waiting for permission to come out. "Sit down," he said. "If you are going to criticize the greatest poets in the English language, you should at least do it in a comfortable chair." Elara sat. The Duke sat in the chair opposite her, the chair that Mrs. Aldridge later told her had been Lady Catherine's chair, the chair no one had sat in since she died. And he did not flinch when Elara settled into it, though she saw his eyes flicker to the chair for a moment, a brief acknowledgement of what it meant, before he looked away. They talked. They talked for 2 hours. They talked about poetry and architecture, and the proper way to prune a damask rose, and the proper way to make soup, about which Elara had strong opinions, and the Duke had none, because the Duke had never made soup in his life, and regarded the process with the suspicious fascination of a man who has just learned that the food he eats does not simply appear from the air. They talked about books, and about the difference between reading a book because you love it, and reading a book because you are afraid to put it down and face the silence that waits on the other side. They talked about silence itself, and the Duke said, quietly, that there were 2 kinds, the kind that is peaceful, and the kind that is an absence, and that for 2 years he had lived in the second kind, and it was like drowning in air. Elara listened. She listened the way she did everything, with her whole self, with an attention so focused and so complete that the Duke felt, for the first time since Catherine died, that the words leaving his mouth were landing somewhere, that they were being received, that someone was hearing not just what he said, but what he meant, which were, as they always are, 2 very different things. He did not tell her about Catherine, not that day, not directly. but Catherine was in the room with them, in the chair Ilara sat in the books on the shelves, in the way the Duke's voice caught sometimes on certain words, as though the words had thorns in them that pricked his throat on the way out. When the clock struck 5, Ilara stood. "I should go. Mrs. Aldridge will think I have been kidnapped." "Or that you are dusting." "Which, as we have established, I was." "With your eyes." "They are very efficient eyes." He looked at her, and the smile was gone now, but its memory remained, like warmth in a room after the fires died. "Come back tomorrow," he said. It was not a question. It was not an order. It was somewhere between the two, in the uncharted space where a request lives when the person making it has forgotten how to ask for things. "I will," Ilara said. She came back. She came back the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. Every afternoon, when her duties were finished and the house was clean and the garden had been tended and the fire in the study had been lit, she went to the library, and the Duke was there, and they talked. The subjects ranged and wandered like paths through a forest. One afternoon it was history, the rise and fall of empires, and the Duke spoke about Rome with the kind of passionate precision that made the dead civilizations feel alive and urgent, as though the fall of Rome was not something that had happened centuries ago, but something that was happening right now, in this library, and required immediate attention. Another afternoon it was music, and Ilara confessed that she could sing, that her mother had taught her, and the Duke asked her to sing, and she refused, and he did not press. But the question hung in the air between them like a held breath, waiting. Another afternoon it was silence. They sat in their chairs, Ilara with a book, the Duke with his charcoal and paper, drawing not his wife this time, but the view from the library window, the garden, the wall, the climbing rose, and the silence between them was neither peaceful nor absent. It was something new, a third kind, the kind of silence that exists between two people who do not need words to be in the same room together, the kind that is not empty, but full of the awareness of another person, their breathing, their presence, the particular way they turn a page or shift in a chair, the tiny, intimate sounds of a life being lived beside your own. It was in this silence, on a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of November, that the Duke put down his charcoal, looked at Ilara, and said, "I need to tell you about Catherine." Ilara closed her book. She did not speak. She waited. "We were married for 3 years," he said. His voice was steady, controlled, the way a man's voice is controlled when he is holding it in place by sheer force of will. She was the kindest person I have ever known. She was intelligent and funny, and she could not bake bread to save her life, and she laughed at my drawings, and she made this house feel like a home instead of a monument. And I loved her with every single part of me that was capable of love, which, at the time, I believed was considerable. He paused. The charcoal was still in his hand, and his fingers were grey with it, and he was not looking at Ilara. He was looking at the drawing on the table, the garden, the rose, the wall. She died on a Friday morning. I held her hand. She asked me to close the window because she was cold, and I closed it, and she died. And the last thing I thought, the very last thing that went through my mind as I held her hand and felt it go still, was not, "I love you," or "I will miss you," or even "goodbye." He stopped. His jaw worked. The knuckles of his hand whitened around the charcoal. The last thing I thought was, I should have called the doctor sooner. Ilara did not move. She did not breathe. "I waited," the Duke said. "The fever came on Wednesday. I thought it would pass. She was young and strong, and fevers pass. I told myself it would pass. I waited through Wednesday night and Thursday morning and Thursday afternoon. And by Thursday evening, when I finally sent for the doctor, it was too late. The doctor came, and he looked at her, and he looked at me, and he said, "Your Grace, if I had been called yesterday, I might have been able to help." And then she died, and I closed the window, and I have not opened it since. He looked up. His eyes, which had been ice and silver and stone for as long as Ilara had known him, were something else now. They were water. They were rain. They were the surface of a lake in which something very deep and very heavy had finally, after 2 years of sinking in silence, hit the bottom. "I killed her," he said. "Not with a weapon, not with malice, with hesitation, with the arrogance of a man who believed he knew better than the world what his wife needed. I waited, and she died. And every morning when I stand in front of her portrait, I am not mourning her. I am confessing. I am telling her that I am sorry, that I should have been better, that if I could go back, I would go back, and I would send for the doctor, and I would save her. And I cannot go back, and I cannot save her, and I cannot stop standing there, because if I stop, I am admitting that it is over, and that I have to live the rest of my life carrying the weight of what I did." The silence that followed was the longest silence Ilara had ever experienced. It was not a silence of absence or peace or fullness. It was a silence of grief, raw and naked and terrible, and it filled the room the way floodwater fills a house, rising to the level of every door and window, threatening to drown everything inside. Ilara stood. She crossed the space between their chairs. She knelt beside him, on the carpet, beside the table where his drawing lay, and she looked up at his face, which was carved with the same lines of pain she had seen on the first morning in the hall, but which now, finally, she understood. "You did not kill her," she said. "You do not know that. I know that a fever in 3 days is a fever that would have killed her whether the doctor came on Wednesday or Thursday or at the first cough. I know that because my mother died the same way, the same fever, the same 3 days. And the doctor was there from the beginning, and it made no difference. Because some things cannot be stopped, no matter how quickly you move, or how loudly you shout, or how desperately you hold on." The Duke looked at her. His expression changed, not all at once, but in stages, like the layers of ice on a river breaking up one by one, the surface fracturing, the water beneath becoming visible, cold and dark and moving after years of standing still. "Your mother," he said, "when I was 9, the same fever. The doctor came the first day. He bled her, and he gave her something in a bottle, and he came back every 6 hours, and she died on the 3rd day anyway. And I spent years believing that if I had done something differently, if I had kept her warmer, or fed her more soup, or prayed harder, or been a better daughter, she would have lived. I was 9 years old, and I believed that I had the power to save or kill my mother, because believing that was easier than believing the truth." "What truth?" "That some things are not anyone's fault. That sometimes the world simply takes what it wants, and no amount of love or effort or guilt can stop it. That the only thing more destructive than the loss itself is the story we tell ourselves about how we caused it." The Duke did not speak. He looked at her, and the water in his eyes spilled over, a single line down each cheek, and he did not wipe them away, and Ilara did not look away. And this was the moment, the turning point, the crack in the ice becoming a fracture, becoming a break, becoming, at last, the beginning of a thaw. She reached out and took his hand. His fingers were grey with charcoal, and they were cold, and they were trembling. And when her hand closed around his, the trembling stopped. Not gradually, not slowly. It stopped all at once, as though his body had been waiting for exactly this, for the touch of another person's hand, for the pressure and warmth and reality of skin against skin. And the trembling stopped, and his fingers closed around hers and held on. They stayed like that for a long time, long enough for the light in the library to change from the pale gold of afternoon to the deep amber of early evening, long enough for the fire in the grate to burn low and need attention, long enough for Mrs. Aldrich to come to the library door, see them through the gap, press her hand to her mouth, and walk away without making a sound, her eyes bright with something that was not tears. Because Mrs. Aldrich did not cry, except that she did, later, in the kitchen, over the soup, and blamed it on the onions. When Alara finally stood, her knees were stiff and her hand was warm where his had held it, and the Duke looked up at her from his chair with an expression she had never seen on his face. Not cold, not guarded, not grieving. Open, terrified, hopeful. "You should eat tonight," she said, because she did not know how to say what she was actually feeling, which was so large and so unfamiliar that it did not fit inside any words she knew. "I will eat tonight," he said, and he meant it. He ate that night. He ate everything on his plate. And when Mrs. Aldrich came to collect the dishes and found them empty for the first time in 2 years, she stood in the dining room doorway and said nothing for a full minute, which was, for Mrs. Aldrich, the equivalent of a standing ovation. The weeks that followed were the slow, careful unfolding of two people learning to exist in the same world without armor. It was not easy. It was not a straight line. There were days when the Duke retreated, when the study door was locked and the fire went unlit, and the books on the kitchen table stopped appearing. And Alara would know, without being told, that the grief had returned, that the old wound had reopened, and that the man behind the locked door needed space and silence, and the knowledge that when he emerged, someone would still be there. She was always there. And there were days when the Duke was present, really present, in a way that startled even himself. Days when he came down to the kitchen and sat at the long table and watched Mrs. Aldrich cook and asked questions about the recipes that Mrs. Aldrich answered with the barely concealed delight of a woman who had been waiting 2 years for someone to care about the provenance of her parsnip soup. Days when he walked the grounds in daylight instead of darkness, and the servants, seeing him from the windows, exchanged glances that were equal parts hope and caution, because they had seen him break once and were not sure the world could survive him breaking again. Days when he and Alara sat in the library and talked, and the talking became easier, more natural, less like a negotiation, and more like a conversation between two people who had discovered, against all odds and expectations, that they understood each other. Not perfectly, not completely, but in the ways that mattered, in the ways that had to do with loss and loneliness, and the stubborn, irrational, beautiful refusal to give up on the possibility that life could still surprise you. It was in December, on a night when the first snow of winter was falling outside the library windows, covering the garden in white like a blank page waiting to be written on, that the Duke said, "Alara." It was the first time he had used her name, not the maid, not the girl, Alara. She looked at him. The fire was burning, the light warm and golden on his face, and the snow was falling, silent and relentless. And his eyes, which had been ice and silver and stone and water and rain, were something else now, something she had no name for, something that was all of those things at once and none of them. Because what lived in his eyes at that moment was not a single emotion, but a landscape, vast and complex and utterly, terrifyingly alive. "I am going to say something," he said, "and I need you to let me say it without interruption, because if you interrupt me, I will lose my nerve, and I may not find it again." Alara nodded. "When you came to my gate," he said, I was not walking the grounds because I could not sleep. I was walking the grounds because I was trying to decide whether to stop. Whether to stop eating, stop sleeping, stop walking, stop existing. I had spent 2 years in a room with a closed window and a dead fire, and a drawing I could not finish, and I had reached the end of what I was able to endure, and I was walking in the rain because the rain felt like something, and I needed to feel something, even if the only thing available was cold. He paused. His hands were in his lap, and they were steady, and his voice was steady, and Alara understood that the steadiness was not ease, but effort. The effort of a man who has practiced this speech 100 times in his head and is now delivering it for the first and only time. And then you were there, at the gate, in the rain. And you said, "I have nowhere to sleep tonight." And I heard something in those words that I recognized. Not the words themselves, the feeling beneath them. The feeling of being at the end of a road that goes nowhere, with nothing behind you and nothing in front of you, and the rain coming down, and no one in the entire world who cares whether you make it through the night. He looked at her. You saved my life. Not by doing anything extraordinary, not by being a hero or an angel, or any of the things that stories say. You saved my life by being cold and wet and honest, and standing at my gate saying the truest thing anyone had said to me in 2 years. You saved my life by needing help, because I had forgotten that helping someone was something I could still do. I had forgotten that I was still capable of anything that was not grief. His voice broke. It broke the way a voice breaks when it has been holding something too heavy for too long, and the muscles finally give way. Not dramatically, not loudly. It just cracked, like a branch under the weight of snow, and the sound of it was the most honest sound Alara had ever heard. I cannot offer you what a man should offer when he says what I am about to say, he continued, and his voice was rough now, scraped raw, but he did not stop. I am broken. I am grieving. I carry a guilt that may never leave me, regardless of what you said about the fever and the doctor and the things that are not our fault. I am a man with a dead wife and a cold house and a drawer full of drawings that will never be right. I have nothing to offer you except this, except the truth, which is that you have become the first thing I think about when I wake up, and the last thing I think about before I sleep. And in between, every hour is measured by whether I will see you. And I do not know what to call this, because the last time I felt something even close to this, it had a name, and the name was love. And I am terrified to use that word, because the last person I loved, I could not save. The snow fell. The fire crackled. The library, with its thousands of books and its centuries of other people's words, was silent, because none of those words were sufficient for this moment. This moment required new words, or no words at all. Alara stood. She crossed the space between their chairs. She stood in front of him, close enough to touch, and she looked down at his upturned face, and she saw everything. The fear, the hope, the grief that would never fully leave, the love that was growing in the space the grief had cleared, fragile and new, and utterly unwilling to be ignored. Adrian, she said. It was the first time she had used his name, his given name, not Your Grace, not the Duke. Adrian. He closed his eyes. His name, in her voice, landed on him like rain on a desert, like the first warmth of spring on ground that has been frozen for years, like a key turning in a lock that everyone, including the man who lived behind it, had believed was permanent. I am not Catherine, she said. I will never be Catherine. I do not want to be Catherine, and you should not want me to be, because Catherine was herself, and I am myself, and the love you had for her is not the same as whatever this is, and it does not need to be. I know, he whispered. I am a servant in your house. I am 17 years old. I have no family, no money, no position, and no future that anyone would consider appropriate for a duke. I know. If you do this, the county will talk. Your sister will be scandalized. Mr. Pemberton will have an opinion, and it will be long, and it will involve many historical precedents. Mrs. Aldridge will cry and claim it is the onions. I know. And you are willing to accept all of that. He opened his eyes. They were clear. They were steady. They were the color of ice, but the ice was melting, and what lay beneath it was warm. I have spent 2 years accepting nothing, he said. I would like to start accepting everything. Elara knelt. She took his face in her hands. His skin was warm from the fire, and his jaw was rough where he had not shaved, and the silver flecks in his eyes were close, so close, like stars in a winter sky, like the frost on the garden wall, like every cold and beautiful thing she had ever seen that had turned out to be something else entirely when she got close enough to touch. Then ask me, she said, properly, with the word. He understood. He took her hands from his face and held them, both of them, and his grip was firm and certain, and his voice, when he spoke, was the voice of a man who has finally decided to stop standing still. Stay, he said. Not as a servant, not as a temporary inconvenience. Stay as yourself. Stay because I love you, and I am saying the word, and I am terrified, and I am saying it anyway, because you taught me that some things are not anyone's fault, and I have decided that some things are not something to be afraid of, and love is one of them. Elara kissed him. She kissed him the way the spring kisses the frozen ground, gentle and inevitable and irreversible. She kissed him, and his hands came up to her face, and his fingers were in her hair, and the fire crackled, and the snow fell. And somewhere in the kitchen, Mrs. Aldridge, who had been listening at the door because she was a cook and cooks know when something is ready, pressed her hand to her mouth and wept openly, and did not blame the onions. The county did talk. Of course they talked. Lord Adrian Hatherley, the Duke of Ashworth, the man who had not spoken to anyone outside his own household for 2 years, had emerged from his mourning and announced his intention to marry his maid. The maid. The girl he had found at his gate in the rain, with no family and no fortune, and no social standing of any kind. A girl who had been dismissed from her last position under suspicion of theft. A girl who was, by every measure that society considered relevant, utterly and completely wrong. The letters arrived like an invading army. From the neighbours, expressing concern. From the county families, expressing dismay. From distant relatives Elara had not known the Duke possessed, expressing alarm and strong reservations, and, in one memorable case, the sincere hope that His Grace has not lost his remaining faculties. Lady Rosalind, the Duke's sister, arrived in person. She came from London on the mail coach, having received the news by letter, and having responded by travelling immediately rather than writing back, because Lady Rosalind was a woman who believed that certain conversations could only be conducted face-to-face, preferably with volume. She was 32, tall like her brother, with the same black hair and the same pale eyes, except that where the Duke's eyes were ice, Lady Rosalind's were fire. She entered Hatherley Manor like a weather system, shedding her travelling coat and her gloves and her opinion simultaneously. "Adrian, you have lost your mind," she said, standing in the great hall with her hands on her hips and her eyes blazing. "You have actually, genuinely, finally lost your mind. I have been waiting for 2 years for you to show some sign of life, and you choose this? A maid? A child? She is 17 years old, for heaven's sake." The Duke stood at the foot of the stairs, calm and unmoved, which infuriated his sister enormously. because it always had. "She is 18 next month," he said. "Oh, well, that changes everything. 18. Practically ancient. Shall I inform the Archbishop?" "Rosalind, do not Rosalind me. I have earned the right to be hysterical. I have written you 104 letters in 2 years, and you have answered none of them. And the first communication I receive is an announcement that you are marrying your maid." "I answered one of your letters." "You did not." "I wrote 'noted' on the back of the October letter and returned it." "That is not an answer. That is a hostage negotiation." Ilara, who had been standing in the corridor behind the kitchen door, listening to this exchange with a mixture of terror and fascination, made the decision that would define the rest of her life. She opened the door. She walked into the great hall. She stood beside the Duke, not behind him, not in front of him, beside him. And she looked at Lady Rosalind with the same steady, unflinching gaze she had turned on every person who had ever underestimated her. "My lady," she said, "my name is Ilara Wynne. I am the person your brother intends to marry. I understand your concern, and I respect it, and I will answer any question you have, honestly and without evasion. But I will not apologize for who I am or where I come from, because those are the things that brought me to this house, and if they had been different, I would not be here, and I believe your brother would be worse for that." Lady Rosalind stared at her. The silence in the great hall was the kind of silence that follows a cannon shot. The stunned, ringing kind. The kind that is not empty, but overwhelmed. Then Lady Rosalind turned to her brother. "She is not what I expected," she said. "No," the Duke agreed. "She is not. She has a backbone. She has several. And she stood up to me. She stands up to everyone. It is both her finest quality and the one most likely to get her killed at a dinner party." Lady Rosalind looked at Ilara again. She looked at her for a long time, and what she was looking for was not beauty or breeding or social graces. She was looking for the thing that Mrs. Aldridge had seen on the first night, and Mr. Pemberton had seen in the hallway, and the Duke had seen at the gate. She was looking for the truth of the girl, the realness of her, the quality that could not be faked or taught or bought. "Very well," Lady Rosalind said at last. "I will stay for a week. I will observe. I will form my own opinion. And if, at the end of the week, I believe you are making a catastrophic mistake, I will say so, loudly and repeatedly, until one of us surrenders." "That seems fair," Ilara said. "It was not meant to be fair. It was meant to be terrifying." "In that case, I am terrified." "You are not terrified at all." "No, but I thought it was polite to pretend." Lady Rosalind's mouth twitched. It was the same twitch the Duke's mouth made, the same almost smile, the same genetic predisposition to be disarmed by honesty and wit. She turned to her brother, and this time her expression was different. Not softer, exactly. Lady Rosalind did not do soft. But something in the fire behind her eyes had banked to a warm glow, and when she spoke, her voice was quieter. "She reminds me of Catherine," she said. The Duke looked at Ilara. Ilara looked at the Duke, and between them, in the space that had once been filled with rain and cold and the terrible question of what happens when you have nowhere to go, there was something new, something warm, something that had no name yet, but would, in time, come to be called home. Lady Rosalind stayed for 3 weeks, not 1. She stayed through the rest of December and into January. And during that time, she did exactly what she had promised. She observed. She watched Ilara move through the house with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood work as a language and spoke it fluently. She watched Ilara tend the garden, coaxing the last of the autumn growth through the frost. She watched Ilara sit in the library with the Duke, arguing about poetry and architecture and the proper way to prune roses. And she watched the Duke's face during these arguments. And what she saw there was a man she had given up on coming back to life. She saw the drawings. Not the old ones, the failed portraits of Catherine with the wrong eyes. The new ones. The Duke had started drawing again, but he was no longer drawing his dead wife. He was drawing Ilara. Ilara in the garden. Ilara by the fire. Ilara reading in the library, with her legs curled under her, and her brow furrowed, and her lower lip caught between her teeth. A habit she was not aware of, and that the Duke had captured with a tenderness that made the charcoal lines look less like art and more like prayer. On the 14th day, Lady Rosalind found Ilara alone in the kitchen and sat down opposite her and said, "Tell me about the silver spoon." Ilara told her. She told her everything. The house where she had worked, the mistress who had accused her, the dismissal without reference, the 6 hours of walking in the rain, the gate, the Duke. She told it simply and directly, without self-pity, without embellishment, without the kind of narrative reshaping that people do when they want to cast themselves as heroes of their own misfortune. She told it the way it happened, because the way it happened was enough. When she finished, Lady Rosalind was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And the spoon?" "I did not take it." "Do you know who did?" "I believe it was the mistress's son. He had a habit of taking small things and selling them in the village. Everyone in the house knew, but no one said anything because he was the son, and I was the maid. And when something goes missing, it is always the maid." "That," said Lady Rosalind, with the precise, clipped diction of a woman who has identified an injustice and intends to correct it, "is unacceptable." 3 weeks later, Ilara received a letter. It was from the family she had worked for. It contained an apology, a sum of money representing the wages she had been owed, and a letter of reference, so glowing that it bordered on fiction. Ilara did not know, and would not learn until much later, that Lady Rosalind had paid a personal visit to the household, had made inquiries, had located the silver spoon in the possession of a pawnbroker in the village, and had confronted the mistress with a level of aristocratic fury that was still being discussed in the county 3 years later. When Ilara thanked her, Lady Rosalind waved a hand as though she had done nothing more significant than return a borrowed book. "I did not do it for you," she said. "I did it because it was wrong, and I have a constitutional inability to tolerate wrong things. It is a family trait. Adrian has it too, though he expresses it by brooding instead of acting, which is less effective but more dramatic." The wedding took place in March, on a day when the first crocuses were pushing through the garden soil and the climbing rose on the south wall had begun to bud. It was small. It was quiet. The guests were few. Lady Rosalind, Mrs. Aldrich, Mr. Pemberton, Agnes with her bad knee propped on a cushion, Mr. Farrow the coachman, and the vicar who performed the ceremony with the bewildered gratitude of a man who had been told that the Duke of Ashworth was getting married and had assumed it was a practical joke until the Duke himself appeared at the altar. Ilara wore a dress that Lady Rosalind had sent from London, ivory silk with lace at the collar and cuffs, and when she walked down the aisle of the small chapel on the estate grounds, the Duke, standing at the altar with his hands clasped behind his back and his pale eyes steady, looked at her and did not smile. He did something better than smile. He exhaled. A single, long, slow breath, as though he had been holding it for 2 years and had finally been given permission to let it go. The vows were simple. The ring was not. It was a gold band set with a single emerald, engraved with vines and roses, and it had belonged to the Duke's mother, and her mother before her, and her mother before her, back through the generations to a time when the Hatherley family was young, and the house was new, and the garden was just a patch of earth, waiting for someone to plant the first seed. After the ceremony, there was a meal in the kitchen, not the dining room, because Ilara had insisted, and the Duke had agreed, and Mrs. Aldridge had wept with joy and immediately begun cooking enough food for 40 people, despite there being only 8. The meal was loud and warm and full of laughter, and the Duke sat at the head of the long kitchen table and ate everything on his plate and asked for more, and Mrs. Aldridge served him a second helping with trembling hands and a face that was doing something complicated with tears and flour and pride. Mr. Pemberton gave a toast. He stood at his place, ramrod straight, his silver hair gleaming in the candlelight, his waistcoat as impeccable as ever, and he raised his glass and said, "To His Grace and Her Grace, who have reminded us that the purpose of a great house is not to be great, but to be a home. And to Mrs. Aldridge, whose soup was, as always, adequate." Mrs. Aldridge threw a bread roll at him. He caught it without changing expression. Agnes laughed so hard she fell off her cushion. That night, after the guests had gone and the kitchen had been cleaned and the house was quiet, the Duke and Ilara stood in the garden. The moon was full, and the air was cold, and the crocuses were small purple and white points of light in the dark earth, and the climbing rose on the south wall was a tangle of new growth, reaching upward, reaching for the sun that would come tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. "I want to show you something," the Duke said. He led her to the study. The room was warm, the fire lit, the window closed. On the desk, beside the old charcoal drawing of Catherine with the wrong eyes, was a new drawing, a portrait. Ilara looked at it. It was her, but it was not just her. It was her in the garden, kneeling beside the sundial, looking up, and the expression on her drawn face was the expression she had worn on the day he had watched her from the window and decided not to step back into the shadow. The expression was not beautiful, not in the conventional sense. It was real. It was alive. It was the face of a person who is doing ordinary work in an ordinary place and does not know she is being watched by someone who is falling in love with her. And the eyes were right. Ilara looked at the drawing for a long time. Then she looked at the drawing of Catherine. Then she looked at the Duke. "You got the eyes right," she said. "Yes," he said. "I think, perhaps, I was trying to draw the wrong eyes." He reached past her and picked up the drawing of Catherine. He held it for a moment, looking at the face he had spent 2 years trying to capture, the face that had been fading from his memory like ink from a page left in the sun. Then he walked to the fireplace mantel and set it there, upright, leaning against the wall where the firelight caught it and warmed it and made the charcoal lines glow. "She belongs here," he said. "Not in a drawer, not on a desk where I torture myself with what I cannot get right. Here, in the light, where I can see her and remember her and let her go." He turned to Ilara, and his face, in the firelight, was open and clear and unguarded, and the ice in his eyes had melted so completely that what remained was not cold at all, but something warm, something deep, something that had been waiting beneath the surface for a very long time, the way the crocuses wait beneath the frozen ground, patient and certain that the spring will come. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For having nowhere to sleep that night, for standing at my gate, for saying the truest thing anyone had said to me in 2 years. He took her hand. "For closing the window, for lighting the fire, for insulting Mrs. Aldridge's goose, for disagreeing with Tennyson, for writing in the margins of my books with the handwriting of a deranged sparrow. It is hardly legible. It is barely legible. I have seen better penmanship from the doctor, and his prescriptions are in Latin." She laughed. He laughed. And the sound of their laughter, together, in the warm study with the fire burning and the drawings on the mantel, and the snow beginning to fall again outside the closed window, was the sound of a house becoming a home, and a home becoming a life, and a life becoming the kind of story that people remember. 5 years passed. The garden at Hatherley Manor was, by any reasonable measure, the finest garden in the county. The roses had been restored, all 47 varieties, including the damask and the bourbon, both of which Ilara pruned with the ruthless efficiency of a woman who had been corrected on the subject by a duke and had responded by becoming the foremost authority on rose cultivation within a 50-mile radius. The sundial told the time again. The box hedges were trimmed to geometric precision. And in the southeast corner, in a bed that had once been choked with weeds, there was a patch of lavender that bloomed every summer in such abundance that its scent could be smelled from the road, and travellers passing by would slow their carriages and close their eyes and breathe and wonder where they were. The house had changed. Not its structure, which was stone and had no intention of changing for anyone, but its atmosphere. The windows were open, the fires were lit. The morning room was used every morning, and the drawing room was used every evening. And the dining room, which could seat 24, regularly did, because Lady Rosalind had made it her personal mission to drag her brother back into society, and Ilara had made it her personal mission to make society interesting enough to deserve him. There were children, a boy named Thomas, who was 4 and had his mother's auburn hair and his father's serious eyes, and a deep, unshakable conviction that the garden sundial was a secret door to another world. A girl named Catherine, who was 2, and had her father's black hair and her mother's stubbornness, and a laugh that could be heard from one end of the house to the other, a sound that had not existed in these halls for years, and that, once it arrived, made everyone who heard it wonder how they had ever tolerated the silence. The Duke drew. He drew constantly, obsessively, joyfully. He drew the children and the garden and the house and the roses and Ilara, always Ilara, in every light and every season. And the drawings filled the study walls, and then the hallway walls, and then the morning room walls, until the house was papered not with the expensive silk that had been there when he inherited it, but with the record of a life being lived, fully and messily, and with gratitude. The portrait of Catherine still stood on the mantel. It would always stand there. And beside it, in a frame that the Duke had made himself, badly, with uneven corners and a crack in the glass that he could not fix, and that Ilara refused to let him replace because she said it was the most beautiful frame she had ever seen, precisely because it was imperfect, was the drawing of Ilara in the garden. 2 faces, 2 loves, 2 chapters of the same life, different in every way except the one that mattered, which was that both had been real. On an evening in autumn, 5 years to the day after the night of the storm, the Duke and Ilara sat in the garden. The children were inside, asleep, watched over by Mrs. Aldrich, who had not retired because she refused to, and because the Duke had given up asking, because the last time he asked, she had responded by making a goose so terrible that even Mr. Pemberton, who never commented on food twice, had commented on food twice. The air was cool. The stars were out. The climbing rose on the south wall, the one that had survived 2 years of neglect, and had been the first thing Ilara tended when she came to this house, was in its final bloom of the season. Its pale pink flowers opened to the night sky, like hands reaching for something that could not be held, but only witnessed. "Adrian," Ilara said. "Yes." "Do you remember what you said to me, the night you found me at the gate?" He looked at her. In the starlight, his eyes were silver again, but not the silver of ice, the silver of moonlight on water, the silver of something alive and moving and beautiful. "I said you were trespassing," he said. "Yes." "And then I said you were a temporary inconvenience." "Yes." He reached for her hand. He held it the way he always held it, firmly, certainly, with the grip of a man who has learned the cost of letting go and has decided, once and for all, that he will not pay it again. "I was wrong," he said. "About which part?" "The temporary part." Elara smiled. She leaned into him, her head against his shoulder, his arm around her, and they sat in the garden they had built together, in the life they had built together, in the home they had made from a house that had once been a monument to grief. And the stars turned slowly above them, and the roses bloomed, and the autumn air carried the scent of lavender and earth, and the particular, unrepeatable sweetness of a love that had been earned, not given, not demanded, not assumed, earned. Through rain and silence, and cold rooms and locked doors, and books left on kitchen tables, and arguments about poetry, and drawings that could not get the eyes right, and a confession made beside a dying fire, and a kiss in a library while the snow fell, and a ring engraved with vines and roses, and a life, an entire life, built on the foundation of 5 words, spoken by a girl with nowhere to go, to a man with nowhere left to fall. "I have nowhere to sleep tonight." And the Duke, who had once believed he had nothing left, had opened his gate. And the girl, who had once believed she was nothing, had walked through. And neither of them, not once, not ever, not for a single moment in the years that followed, regretted it.